Carry on, everybody. All right, good morning, everybody. You know, today the legacy continues here at RAF Molesworth as we celebrate Hell's Angels Day. Okay, 68 years ago today, Hell's Angels, B-17 Flying Fortress, which almost certainly would have been maintained in this hangar, took to the skies for a mission against an aircraft factory in occupied France. When it again touched down at a main runway about 100 feet in that direction, on May 13, 1943, it made history as the first Air Force bomber to complete 25 combat missions. Our honored guest and speaker today, Lieutenant Colonel retired Eddie Deerfield, arrived at Molesworth a few months after that day. Lieutenant Colonel Deerfield has had an amazing career. He was a B-17 radio man in aerial combat with the 303rd Bomb Group here, ending the war as a tech sergeant. He survived a ditching in the English Channel on his 6th mission, jumping from a flaming B-17 on his 14th, crash landed on his 20th, and he was actually wounded by flak during his 30th and last mission here at RAF Molesworth. After the war, and after getting his degree and working as a reporter and a columnist for the Chicago Times, he rejoined the Army as a psychological warfare officer, and he served in the Korean conflict in the 1950s, rising to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Next, he served for over 20 years as a U.S. Information Agency officer, retiring as a counselor in the U.S. Senior Foreign Service. And since then, he's noted as a publisher and a speaker, and we're lucky to have him here today. 8,960 brave service members served on this base during World War II, and 841 last walked the earth here at RAF Molesworth. The memorial at our gate, which Lieutenant Colonel Deerfield helped build as part of the 303rd Bomb Group Association, reminds us every day of their sacrifice. So what I'd like to do is give a warm welcome, and welcome back to your base, sir, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. And I'm so delighted to see so many of you here. And I want to thank you, Colonel Glenns, for the very nice introduction. I'm here to confirm that everything you said was absolutely true. It's not easy to express in words what being here means to me. For the surviving veterans of the 303rd Bomb Group, Molesworth is often on our minds and always in our hearts. 65 years ago, from 1942 to 1945, we lived and worked here. Combat crews went off in B-17 Flying Fortress bombers to attack targets in Nazi Germany and in occupied Europe. All too often, our men in the bombers didn't make it back to Molesworth. They died in battle, were missing in action, or became prisoners of war. The casualty rate among bomber crews was higher than for any American combat unit in any branch of the service in the war, either in Europe or the Pacific. You may wonder why old veterans come here to reminisce with fondness about events that were savage and terrible, about a time when young men in their teens and 20s lived life one day at a time. I was 19 when I flew my first mission as a radio operator and gunner in July of 1943. Some of us survived, and we marvel at that. We were the lucky ones. The Nissan huts and the frame headquarters buildings, supply buildings, administration buildings here at Molesworth are long gone. But the bittersweet memories linger on. Memories of my crew's crash in the North Sea on our 6th mission. The parachute jump from a falling B-17 on our 14th mission. 2 crash landings, blood on my face from a shrapnel wound on our 30th mission. But most traumatic of all, memories of the men I knew so well who were killed in combat. World War II was the most massive and devastating conflict in history. There were 6 long and bloody years of combat involving every major world power fought over many thousands of square miles, from the hedgerows of Normandy, the sweltering deserts of Libya, the icy mountains of Norway, the streets of Stalingrad, the insect-infected jungles of Borneo and Bombay, and the coral reef islands in the Pacific. And at its end, many millions had lost their lives, and most of Europe, large parts of Asia, lay in ruins. The war in Europe ended in the defeat of Hitler's Germany in May of '45 and ended 3 months later with victory over Japan. I enlisted as a private in the Army Air Corps in July of 1942 at the age of 18. The United States didn't have a separate Air Force in those days. I went by Greyhound bus from my home in Chicago to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, near St. Louis for basic training. Base personnel had to decide what I would do in the Air Corps. Well, they must have figured he comes from Chicago, the shoot-'em-up gangster town, so they made me an aerial gunner. In the 4th and final week of training in gunnery at a desert base in Nevada, we flew in an AT-6 single-engine aircraft and fired a .30 caliber machine gun at a target sleeve towed by another AT-6 about 100 yards away. We were told in advance that anyone who missed the sleeve and shot down the AT-6 would flunk the course. I was selected for additional training as a radio operator and sent to Salt Lake City. We lived in converted stables at the Utah State Fairgrounds. Then Blythe, California, where 10-man crews were formed for training on the B-17 Flying Fortress, and we lived in tents set up on the desert. Next, Pio, Texas, for more crew training. Finally, in May, late May of 1943, we flew across the Atlantic on a B-17 to join the 303rd Bomb Group based here at Molesworth. And I was now a technical sergeant, a 5-striper in the old Army Air Corps. Now, a little bit about the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was named by Aviation Magazine as the 20th century's most outstanding heavy bomber in any nation's Air Force in the 20th century. Now, it's a small aircraft by modern standards, wingspan of 100 feet, fuselage length of about 75 feet, and that's not even half the size of a Boeing 747. Cruising speed, only 200 miles an hour. Landing speed, 90 miles an hour. We carried a maximum bomb load of 8,000 pounds. Why is it called a flying fortress? The B-17F, and I flew half of my missions in the F, was equipped with 11 50 caliber machine guns. In the G model, a chin turret was added below the nose, and that gave us 2 more 50 caliber machine guns. In this very hangar in which we're now sitting, our bombers damaged in combat or needing other repairs came to be healed so they could fly again. Each of our bombers had a name and artwork painted on the nose, often a young lady wearing a bikini. Now, the name of our favorite B-17 was Isa Available. She wasn't wearing anything. The 303rd's best-known bomber was Hell's Angels, the first B-17 in the entire 8th Air Force to complete 25 combat missions. And that historic event happened exactly 68 years ago on 13 May 1943. The target that day was an aircraft factory in France. Now, as probably many of you know, for more than half a century, the 91st Bomb Group, based at Bassingbourn, claimed that its B-17, Memphis Belle, was the first to fly 25 missions, although it didn't actually reach that mark until 6 days later. What some of you may not know is that it wasn't until only 5 years ago, when the Memphis Belle was undergoing restoration at the National Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, that the record was officially set straight. The president of the 91st Bomb Group Association sent a letter, and he sent me a copy of that letter, to the museum director, a retired Major General Metcalf, and he wrote, "We would like to assure that history is correctly represented when the Memphis Belle is displayed. We recognize that the honor of flying the first 25 combat missions appeared to belong to a B-17 of the 303rd Bomb Group." Now, how did the legend, the misinformation about the Memphis Belle get started? An article in the New York Times explained, with all the news about the heavy losses in the air war against Germany, there was an urgent need for a story to lift the nation's morale. Now, ask yourself, a bomber named for a lovely lady, a sweetheart, in a popular American city was far more attractive to the media, than a bomber with the name Hell's Angels. So the decision was made to give the credit to Memphis Belle strictly for public relations reasons. On August 27th of 1943, Eyes Available, which was my favorite B-17, was so badly shot up over Wartime, France, a Nazi rocket installation, that we made a crash landing at the Manston Royal Air Force Base. And on the ground, as the 10 of us on the crew walked the perimeter, we counted more than 200 flak holes in the fuselage of our bomber. Now, we spent the night at the British base, and at that time I was a tech sergeant. In the British non-commissioned officers' mess that evening, a chamber music quartet played throughout dinner. I was never able to convince the 303rd High Command here at Molesworth that our non-coms should have chamber music at dinner in the mess halls. As for dear Isa, she never flew again, cannibalized as a donor for spare parts. Then on September 26, 1943, our target was the German submarine pens at Nantes, France. About halfway there, we were still carrying a full bomb load. The mission was recalled because of heavy cloud cover over the target. And soon after we turned for home to come back to Molesworth, an engine on our B-17, this B-17 was named Lady Luck, burst into flame off the south coast of England, and we were about 8,000 feet. At 8,000 feet, when pilot Bob Cogswell ordered us to bail out. Now, I was the crew's senior enlisted man, so I was in contact with the pilot on the plane's intercom system as 5 of us, the tail gunner, the bow turret gunner, the 2 waist gunners, and I, stood at the waist section door, preparing to jump. And I said to the pilot on intercom, and he was a great pilot. He brought us through a crash in the North Sea and other crash landings. Said to the pilot, we knew he could get us home, and asked if we could stay with the plane. And Bob Cogswell said, you can stay with the plane, I'm going to bail out. So I remember turning to the other 4 men standing there with me, giving them the go signal. And one after another we jumped. We're not paratroopers. We came down in trees, on rooftops, on farmers' fields, near the town of Winchester in the south of England. I came down backwards. And when I hit the ground, whomp, it stunned me for a while. Lying there on my back, I opened my eyes. There was a British farmer standing over me with a pitchfork pressed against my chest. Well, you know, this was in 1943. He had seen all those men jumping from a 4-engine plane and thought we were German paratroopers invading England. After we returned to base here at Molesworth the following day, I took a bottle of scotch to the parachute riggers as a token of my appreciation. And that's when I learned the name of the manufacturer of my parachute. My life was saved by the American Ladies Corset Company. Bob Cogswell, the pilot, was the last to jump from the burning B-17. He stayed with the plane until he was sure it wouldn't crash into a town in the south of England. We were still carrying a load of 10 500-pound demolition bombs. When Bob's chute opened, it tore some ligaments in his back, and he was unable to finish his combat tour with the 303rd. And the sad story is that after his back healed, he returned to the States to train on B-29s, and Captain Robert Cogswell, our pilot here at Molesworth, who brought us down safely in the North Sea, was killed in action during the Korean War when his B-29 crashed in the Yellow Sea. His body was never recovered. Early in 1944, the P-51 Mustang fighter joined the P-47 to give bombers long-range protection over enemy territory. I was on a B-17, incidentally, which was named, and these names came out of anywhere. B-17 named Virgin Mary, when the 8th Air Force launched the first combat mission of the war against Berlin. This was on March 6th of 1944. Then, 2 months later, On the 30th and final mission of my combat tour, I was wounded by flak over Saarbrücken, Germany. Our 303rd Bomb Group flew more combat missions, 364, than any other B-17 group in the entire European theater of operations. Of my original crew of 10, only 4 of us completed a full tour, often flying as replacements with other crews after we lost our pilot. We were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, 3 Oak Leaf Clusters, a number of theater ribbons, battle stars, and if wounded, the Purple Heart. I was initiated into 2 clubs. Those were tough initiations. The crash at sea qualified me as a member of the Goldfish Club. And more familiar, the bailout from our burning bomber, and I became a member of the Caterpillar Club. So that's a look at the life and times of American airmen in England during World War II. A roller coaster ride. On leave in London, or just visiting a nearby town like Northampton, Bedford, Kettering, going dancing or to the theater, or to a nice restaurant, and then back to the air base to face injury or death in the skies over Germany and occupied Europe. By the end of the war, over 27,000 combat airmen in the European theater of operations were killed in action, and more than 47,000 were wounded or became prisoners of war. U.S. Army Air Force bombers were never once, despite horrific losses, turned back from their mission of striking Germany's strategic, industrial, and military targets. The attacks on the Nazi regime weakened the enemy so greatly that we were able to launch the invasion of France on June 6, 1944, months earlier than would otherwise have been possible. About 8 years ago, I was interviewed for a documentary about aerial combat in World War II. It was recorded on a DVD. We're going to show you that DVD now, and in some of the scenes, you will recognize the Triangle C on the tail of the B-17s based here at Molesworth. Let's watch it now, and then when we finish, I'll come back for a few closing remarks.
It's hard to say what was typical. Every mission was different. You could never be sure of what would happen once you took off. The way it would start out, someone from squadron headquarters would come to each of our quarters, our Nissen huts, about 4 in the morning to wake us up for a mission. We would then go to breakfast, and the good thing about the mission mornings is that they served us fresh eggs instead of the powdered eggs we usually got on other mornings. Then we went on to briefings about the target, weather conditions, what to expect in the way of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire from the ground. There were 10 of us on a crew: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and a tail gunner. Now, I flew my 30 missions as a radio operator and gunner. But my combat tour was not typical. I'm told that I'm probably the only airman in the 8th Air Force to have survived the crash at sea, a bailout from a falling B-17, 2 crash landings, and being wounded in combat, all of this happening on 5 different missions. Well, one thing I think that was typical about bombing missions against enemy targets German fighter planes and heavy flak never once during the entire course of the air war against Germany, never once forced American bomber formations to retreat from our target destinations. Let me tell you about the mission that probably remains more deeply embedded in my memory than any of my other 30 missions, with the possible exception of the bailout we did when the plane was falling apart. And this was after or during a mission to Kassel, Germany in July of 1943. We encountered enemy aircraft, Messerschmitt 109s and FW 190s on the way in and on the way back, heavy flak constantly. By the time we reached the target, 2 of our engines had been shot out. We still went on, as all the bombers did, and hit the target and then turned to come back for home. Again, more enemy attacks, more fighter attacks, more anti-aircraft barrages from the ground. We were coming back on 2 engines. When we got about halfway back to our base in Molesworth, England, the 3rd engine failed. We were using so much gas to maintain the 1 and 2 engines we had left that as we approached the coast, the pilot called out to the crew, "We may not be able to make it all the way back to our base in England or to any emergency base in England. Better prepare for ditching." Ditching meaning, of course, a crash at sea. We began throwing out everything that was movable. We threw out our machine guns. We threw out our everything, our flak jackets, our radio equipment. The only radio equipment that we kept intact was my equipment, and I was the radio operator. About 40 miles before we hit the coast, the pilot said, "We will have to ditch," and he asked me to start sending out SOS messages. And I'll never forget, da-da-da, da-da-da, again and again and again on my radio transmitter. And then the pilot said, "Assume ditching positions." I locked my transmitter key so it would continue sending out automatically the SOS signals. 8 of us, the 8 members of the crew except for the pilot and co-pilot, squeezed into my radio room, and we sat on the floor facing the tail, and each one of us, 3, and 2, held the man in front of us as tightly as we could, sitting on the floor. When the plane came down, and I learned afterwards, and I credit our pilot with saving our lives, when he came down, he hit the water first with the tail. We had no power at all. The 4th engine had gone out. We were a flying glider. When we came down, he brought the tail down as a brake in the water, pancaked the plane. For the first couple seconds after we hit the water, the North Sea began pouring into the open radio hatch. I felt like a goldfish in a bowl. And I thought, this is it. And then suddenly the water receded as the plane bounced back up. And all of us went out the top hatch, 4 of us onto the left wing, 4 of us onto the right wing. We pulled the lever to release our dinghies. The pilot and co-pilot left by the window in the left front of the plane. And all of us were already in dinghies, 4 or 5 in each dinghy. We had only 1 casualty, and this was the navigator. As the plane hit the water, whoever was holding him wasn't holding him tight enough, or maybe he was in such a position where he was thrown backward onto the plywood radio room door, had a fractured skull, a crushed nose, other facial damage. We lifted him out because he was one of those among the 8 in the radio room, lifted him out. As we sat there in our dinghies floating around, moving away from the plane, because we were afraid that the vacuum created as the plane went down might drag us down too, we sat there watching. The nose went first, and then the tail went under, and that was one of the worst sights I ever saw. Anyway, the injured man was in the same dinghy that I was in, because I was the crew first aid man, and I had my first aid kit. And I remember taking out a morphine syringe from my first aid kit, because he was moaning and really in tremendous pain, slashing the side of his trousers with my knife and plunging this morphine injection into his thigh. And then very shortly after that, he was unconscious and not feeling the pain. And then I set up my Gibson, my radio transmitter for use in dinghies, and tried to run a kite up with the antenna, and the kite just wouldn't fly. So I used my hand crank on the SOS Gibson to try to send out the signal. Now, when we came down in the water, we were roughly midway, about 25 miles from England and about 25 miles from German-occupied Belgium, and we were not sure who would reach us first. Hypothermia was not a problem. This was July. The water was not cold. But we didn't know if the British would get out to us first or the Germans would strafe us from their airfields in Belgium. Well, happily, first a P-47 came over and circled us, waved to us, flew away. Within minutes after that, a British air-sea rescue boat came out, pulled us out of the water, and took us back to England.
In one way or another, scores of our crews are saved by air-sea rescue from the English Channel and the North Sea and returned to combat service. Aside from human values, a trained fortress crew is even more valuable than the plane they man, and the work of the Air-Sea Rescue Unit has been of enormous value to the 8th Air Force.
I flew the first Schweinfurt mission in August of 1943 with the 360th Squadron of the 303rd Bomb Group. And on that mission, although the 303rd was not as heavily hit as some of the other bomb groups, between the bomb groups going to Schweinfurt and the other 8th Air Force bomb group going to Regensburg, the combat formations numbered about 250 bombers, and out of those 250 bombers, about 60 were shot down. Now, we were always told that the acceptable loss rate on a bombing mission was about 10% maximum. Well, apply 60 against 250 and you see how radical a departure that was from the norm. You could expect flak at any time you were over enemy territory, except when you were under German fighter attack, and then the flak would cease. But you could take evasive action. The pilot and the co-pilot could take evasive action against fighter attacks and against flak barrages. If you saw them in a distance, you could try to get the formation to go around them, or maybe even a little higher or a little lower, whatever it was. But you could take evasive action, which sometimes was successful and sometimes was a waste of time, because the the anti-aircraft gunners on the ground had you pretty well zeroed in. But when you reach the IP, when you reach the initial point going in towards the target, and from the time that the pilot turned control of the aircraft over to the bombardier, you were locked in. There was no evasive action. The bombardier controlled the aircraft, and up until the point that the bombardier said, "bombs away," you could not deviate from your course regardless of the flak. Once he said, "bombs away," you were free to weave around.
The American bomber crews who flew raids against Nazi Germany from 1942 to 1945 knew all too well the dangers they faced. From their air bases in England, the men of the Army Air Force attacked heavily defended targets deep inside enemy territory in broad daylight. Once they started on a bomb run, they had to fly straight and level in order to drop their deadly cargo on target. This made them sitting ducks, easy prey for German fighter planes and anti-aircraft gunners. Tens of thousands of airmen perished in the skies over Europe. The entire United States Marine Corps didn't suffer as many casualties in the war against Japan as did the airmen who flew bombers over Germany. They lived on an emotional roller coaster, safe at their air base on one day, in mortal combat the next. The Air Force bombed Europe with B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses. Each plane was rugged and well-suited for the job. Each required a crew of 10 men. On a B-17, 5 guys got the plane where it was supposed to go and do the job it was sent to do. A pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a radio operator, and a bombardier. They sat in the front of the plane. 5 more airmen protected the bomber on its perilous journey. A tail gunner, left and right waist gunners, a top turret gunner, and a ball turret gunner.
Now the war, of course, was 60 years or more away from where we are now. And even now I have occasional nightmares. And the nightmares are not about my own experiences in crashing at sea or bailing out or crash landings or being wounded. It's looking out my radio room window or my radio room hatch and seeing one of the planes in our formation get a direct hit by flak or being hit by an enemy fighter and falling out of formation. And when it fell out of formation, all of us on every crew always tried to follow it down. And our prayer was, and I voiced that prayer many times when I saw one of the planes in our formation break formation because of damage and begin to go down, bail out, bail out, God damn it, bail out. Sometimes you saw parachutes, and sometimes the plane would explode. right before your eyes, and you knew that no one got out. And there have been times when coming back after a mission and coming back to my hut, our Nissen hut at Molesworth in England, and that night seeing the empty bunks of the men who had never come back.
My wife and I wish to extend our thanks to Colonel Matt Gluns for hosting us here at Molesworth, and to Peter Park and Staff Sergeant Elizabeth Payne for planning a program that was well above and beyond the call of duty. Beth's grandfather, who has passed away, was a B-17 navigator, so Beth and I are kind of kinfolks in that sense. And I want to wish best wishes to Colonel Brian Kelly for continued success as the new commander of the 501st Combat Support Wing. It is such a great joy to see how the 303rd Bomb Group is remembered here at Molesworth. Each one of you in the Joint Analysis Center and its affiliated units has the gratitude of the veterans of the 303rd Bomb Group. After more than 65 years, it is you who are keeping us flying. Thank you.
Sir, we wanted to give you a token of appreciation for you and your wife making the trip. And you probably are familiar with Keith Hill,
Yes.
the British aviation artist. And so as we look through, sort of what was appropriate in terms of all the wonderful and great paintings he's done about the 303rd Bomb Group and other B-17 and other units, we decided to get you what's called Welcome Home. And we know that, I'm sure whenever you saw the old Western Church coming back, that you understood that you were home.
Right.
So,
True.
welcome back.
Thank you very much.